welcome to CHeri Knits. I love knitting and I want you to love it too. Today we're going to talk about swatching and how it can make or break your project. Just like crows can make or break your video. Let's get started. All right, let's talk about swatching. A lot of people do not like to swatch, but it's a very, very important part of the process of knitting. I have had many students, customers come to me and say, this isn't the right size, this doesn't fit. And my first question is always, did you swatch? If you don't swatch, you don't have any idea how your piece is going to turn out. Swatching is just knitting a small sample of with the yarn and needles that your pattern recommends. So if you're knitting a pattern, it's going to suggest a certain yarn and certain needles to get a certain gauge. And gauge is just how many stitches you have to the inch. And so you can imagine that everybody knits a little bit different. And if you're a really tight knitter, then your pieces are going to come out small and too tight. And if you're a very loose knitter, your pieces can come out too big, too loose. I happen to be a very loose knitter, and I always have to go down at least 2 to 3 needle sizes to get the proper gauge. So for this particular sample, I used a chunky yarn, and the yarn recommends a size 11, 10.5 or 11 needle. I had to go down to a size 9 to get the proper gauge with this yarn. So let's take a look at how you actually measure your swatch in these different fabrics. So I'm going to take my knit check. There's a lot of different brands of these knit checks. I personally like the Susan Bates knit check. And it has this little cutout where you can lay it right on top of your fabric, and you can count across in 2 inches worth of fabric how many stitches are in there. And so what you're looking for the stitch and garter stitch is the bump right here. It looks kind of like a frown. And we're just going to count those across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So if you have 7 stitches in 2 inches, that's 3.5 stitches to the inch. Now, if you had a pattern that called for 3 stitches to the inch, but you were getting 3.5 stitches to the inch, then your piece would be too small and you would need to go up a needle size. Rows, you count the same way, but you go up. You count those bumps for garter stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And what you need to remember is for garter stitch, every ridge, every one of those bumps is 2 rows. So that's actually 14. And so that's 7 to the inch. And that makes sense because with garter stitch, your stitch and row gauge, your stitches should be half of what your row gauge is. And that's what this is telling me. All right, so let's take a look at how you would measure your gauge and stockinette stitch. You're still going to take your knit check, lay it right over the top of your fabric, and take your needle. I'm using a tapestry needle today, but that helps you keep track of things. And just count the V's going across. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So in 2 inches, I have 7 stitches, which is perfect because I want to have 3.5 stitches to the inch. I like to measure across at least 2 inches and cut it in half. It's really hard to figure out on that one line exactly where you are. So measure at least 2 inches across and cut it in half. And then let's look up at the rows, which are it's gonna be a different number, even though our stitch gauge was the same for stockinette and garter. The row gauge is gonna be just a little bit different. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 5 stitches to the inch for that. And that makes a lot of sense. So I talked earlier about what to do if you have 3.5 stitches to the inch and your pattern calls for 3 stitches to the inch. I know it seems wrong, but you actually need to go to bigger needles to get fewer stitches in there. It's kind of the opposite. It seems counterintuitive, but if you need fewer stitches to the inch, you go to bigger needles. If you need more stitches to the inch, see how I'm got more in there, you'd go to smaller needles to get smaller stitches. So bigger needles for bigger stitches, which means fewer stitches in your inch. Smaller needles for smaller stitches, which gives you more stitches to the inch. That's something that's always confusing to people. All right, let's just recap why you should swatch. I feel like the main reason to swatch is to check your gauge. Again, if you're making a scarf or a blanket where it doesn't really need to fit, a lot of people skip this step. I still like to swatch though, not just for gauge, but just to see if I like the fabric that these needles and this yarn is creating. You might get the gauge, but not like the fabric that you're creating. And so you need to make modifications or get a different yarn. You can practice new stitches or tricky techniques that are in your pattern. Maybe you've never done short rows before, or you're going to try a new cable. So a swatch is a good place to test out that kind of thing. And then also, I think it's a good idea to block your swatch because different fibers will perform differently once they're blocked. And by blocking, I just mean taking your swatch, soaking it in water, laying it flat to dry. I would measure it before and after blocking to see what happens. Some yarns stretch a lot and release during blocking. And so then you can make modifications to your patterns. For instance, maybe if you have something that stretches a lot with the rows, you want to make slightly shorter sleeves so you can allow for that stretch that might happen once it's blocked. All right, I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next video. I hope this video was helpful. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for my Instagram, Ravelry, and Facebook links. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
A lot of crows today.
Hi, welcome to CHeri Knits. There's too many crows. What are they doing?